Friends, at 5 o'clock today, the leaders whom you have heard will go to President Kennedy to carry the demands of this revolution. It is now time for you to act. I will read each demand.
America during the Civil Rights Movement can be characterized as an increasingly violent era. War, racial tensions, and blatant bigotry scarred this time in our country's history. Despite the ever-growing intensity of hatred, Bayard Ruston broke barriers by exposing the oppressor of African Americans and fighting for justice through nonviolent methods. Bayard was raised by his grandparents in their big old house filled with his siblings, neighbors, and sometimes strangers. His grandmother, Julia Ruston, worked tirelessly to improve the lives of those around her because she believed that every human being deserves respect and dignity. Bayard grew up the same way. Julia believed that every person had equal worth and dignity and deserved to be treated as such. It is everyone's responsibility to treat others as a complete human being and not as inferior. Throughout his life, Bayard followed the Quaker tradition of pacifism and nonviolence, which he also learned from his grandmother. She insisted that her children should only use peaceful ways to resolve conflict. In a letter, Bayard wrote, "My activism is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values that were instilled in me by my grandparents who reared me. Those values are based on the concept of a single human family and the belief that all members of that family are equal." He applied this concept throughout his life. As he got older, Bayard joined many organizations who sought equality and peace. He joined the Young Communist League in 1940, where he got a pension for organizing after establishing other YCL clubs in New York. Bayard was given a large role in a campaign to desegregate the military in 1941. He was eager to fight racial segregation in the military and agreed. After the YCL shifted its focus to supporting the military, Bayard left. Bayard, still wanting to fight racial segregation, met with A. Philip Randolph, founder and president of the Sleeping Car Porters, the largest union of African American workers. Bayard joined the March on Washington movement along with Randolph to protest African American exclusion from jobs. Fearing a large-scale march, President Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order stating that there should be no discrimination in the workplace based on race, creed, color, or national origin. Satisfied, Randolph called off the march. Without the March on Washington movement vying for his attention, Bayard was recruited to join the Fellowship of Reconciliation by A.J. Musk, an internationally known pacifist. As a youth secretary, Bayard traveled around the country educating young people about nonviolence and training them in nonviolent tactics. Bayard was also a part of the NAACP and the founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Even after he was arrested in 1944 for not reporting for a required military physical, Bayard continued to break barriers by combating violence with nonviolence. While in jail, Bayard was described as very troublesome. He wrote to the warden about discrimination in the prison as well as ways to fix it. When his plan to desegregate the recreation room ended up with a white prisoner threatening him, Bayard insisted on staying complacent in the matter. The warden congratulated him on his nonviolent response and added that he would consider integrating the cell block where Ruston lived. After organizing the Journey of Reconciliation, an early freedom ride, teaching nonviolence in India and Africa, serving on a chain gang, and joining other various civil rights protests, Bayard was arrested in Pasadena, California for having intimate relations with two men in a parked car. While Bayard believed that it was his right to live as an openly gay man, others thought differently. His sexuality discredited him and led others to mistrust him. A.J. Musk, furious at Ruston for not having control over his sexual behavior, fired him. Other four members also turned their backs on Ruston, fearing that his problem would damage Ford's reputation. Bayard's sexuality was continually used to discredit his work for the rest of his life. Bayard first met Dr. King in the early 50s and soon became his strategist and organizer in 1955. It was Bayard who suggested acting in a Gandhian manner in retaliation to the violence King and the protesters encountered. King, who was not a pacifist at the time, did not know much about the strategies and tactics of nonviolence. With Bayard's help, he came to understand how important it was to be nonviolent at all times, not just when it was convenient. King began to embrace pacifism as a way of life and not just as a useful tactic. Under King, the modern civil rights movement became known as a nonviolent one. In 1963, Bayard was tasked with his biggest project yet, organizing the March on Washington. Because of his past participation in the YCL and his arrest in Pasadena, it was decided that it would be too risky for Bayard to be in such a public position. Bayard worked under A. Philip Randolph with 2 months to plan the event. He drafted plans, bus routes, and help from anyone who could help benefit the march. Bayard's main role was to publicize the event, highlight the demands of the march, and to teach participants about the need for nonviolence. He even recruited hundreds of African American officers as peacekeepers to nonviolently and safely lead troublemakers away. Randolph said Bayard was Mr. March on Washington himself. King even stated that Bayard was a brilliant, effective, and dedicated organizer and one of the most persuasive interpreters of nonviolence. On the day of the march, Bayard watched from backstage as the scheduled civil rights leaders walked up to the podium to speak. After Dr. King's riveting I Have a Dream speech, Bayard stepped up to read the demands of the march. The 1963 March on Washington movement for Jobs and Freedom was the largest and most important nonviolent demonstration for civil rights in the U.S. After the march, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. African Americans still faced violence, brutality, and discrimination in their everyday lives. Bayard continued to speak out against violence, job discrimination, war, and later, gay rights. He protested injustice and violence until his death in 1987. Today, the bigotry and stigma that has left Bayard's work unrecognized is diminishing. His role in the civil rights movement, as well as other aspects of his life, are now being acknowledged. Faced with adversity and a seemingly endless cycle of racism and prejudice, Bayard Ruston continually broke barriers by facing violence head-on with nonviolent methods. A part of almost every civil rights protest from the 1940s until his death, he repeatedly exposed the oppressor of marginalized groups in America and fought for equality for all.